September 28, 1994. Somewhere in the darkness of the Baltic Sea, a passenger ferry battles towering waves and gale-force winds. On board are nearly 1,000 people. Most are asleep. Some are dancing in the ship's nightclub. Others are enjoying a late-night drink, unaware that their world is about to change forever. Within the next hour, one of Europe's worst peacetime maritime disasters will unfold. A disaster so sudden, so devastating, that 852 people will never return home. Survivors will later describe hearing violent metallic bangs echoing through the ship. Investigators will uncover critical design failures. Questions will linger for decades, and an entire nation will mourn those lost beneath the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea. This is the story of the MS Estonia, a story of hope, a story of tragedy, and a disaster that changed maritime safety forever. Long before she became synonymous with tragedy, MS Estonia was simply another passenger ferry serving the busy waters of Northern Europe. Built in 1980 at the renowned Meyer Werft shipyard in Germany, the vessel was launched under the name Viking Sally. For years, she carried passengers safely across the Baltic Sea. Families, tourists, business travelers, students, millions of miles were logged beneath her hull. Countless journeys completed without incident. Over time, the ship changed ownership several times, continuing her service across Northern Europe. Then, in 1993, she entered a new chapter. The vessel was acquired by Esseline, a Swedish-Estonian ferry operator, and renamed Estonia. Esseline operated passenger and vehicle ferry services between Tallinn and Stockholm, creating one of the most important transportation links in the Baltic region. For Estonia, the ferry represented something much greater than transportation. Only a few years earlier, the nation had emerged from decades of Soviet rule. The collapse of the Soviet Union had opened a new era. Trade expanded, tourism increased, business opportunities flourished. The route between Tallinn and Stockholm became a symbol of Estonia's renewed connection with Western Europe. Sailing several times each week across the Baltic Sea, Estonia became more than a ferry. She became a symbol of freedom, of opportunity, of a nation looking toward the future. Business travelers boarded in search of new opportunities. Families crossed the sea to visit loved ones. Students traveled abroad pursuing education and adventure. Tourists explored destinations that had once seemed distant and inaccessible. At nearly 157 meters long and capable of carrying almost 2,000 passengers and crew, the ship was considered modern, reliable, and efficient. To those who sailed aboard her, Estonia seemed dependable, trustworthy, safe. But hidden beneath that reputation was a vulnerability, a weakness that would remain unnoticed until one stormy night in September 1994. Tuesday, September 27, 1994, as evening settled over Tallinn harbor, passengers streamed aboard the Estonia for the overnight voyage to Stockholm. Some carried suitcases, others carried briefcases. Many carried nothing more than the expectation of arriving safely in Sweden the following morning. At approximately 7:15 p.m., the Estonian flagged roll-on, roll-off passenger ferry cast off from Tallinn. On board were 989 people, 803 passengers, 186 crew members. As the vessel cleared the harbor entrance, all four main engines accelerated to full service speed. The crossing had begun. The weather appeared manageable. A southerly wind blew across the Baltic Sea at around 8 to 10 meters per second. Visibility was generally good despite occasional rain showers. Nothing suggested that disaster lay ahead. At approximately 8 p.m., the bridge watch was taken over by the second officer and third officer. The vessel continued westward into the gathering darkness. For several hours, life aboard remained normal. Passengers enjoyed dinner. Music drifted from the bars and lounges. Children settled into their cabins. Crew members performed routine duties. To nearly everyone aboard, it was simply another overnight crossing. As the Estonia moved farther into the Baltic Sea, conditions slowly began to change. Sea conditions along the Estonian coastline remained relatively moderate, but once the vessel left the shelter of coastal waters, the weather became noticeably rougher. The ship developed a slight starboard list, nothing unusual. Investigators would later attribute the list to a combination of cargo distribution, a thwartship's weight disposition, and wind pressure acting on the port side of the vessel. The voyage continued, hour after hour. The wind strengthened gradually. Visibility remained good, more than 10 nautical miles in most areas. Yet the sea itself was becoming increasingly hostile. By midnight, the The wind had veered to the southwest and strengthened to between 15 and 20 meters per second. Significant wave heights reached approximately 3 to 4 meters. The ship's rolling and pitching became increasingly noticeable. Passengers found it more difficult to walk through corridors. Some became seasick. Others abandoned the public areas and returned to their cabins. For experienced sailors, rough weather in the Baltic Sea was nothing extraordinary. The Estonia had sailed through storms before. No one on board imagined that this night would be any different. At approximately 12:25 a.m., the Estonia was making about 14 knots. Heavy seas struck the vessel on her port bow. The ship rolled heavily. To counter the increasingly violent motion, the vessel's fin stabilizers were extended. Still, the pounding continued. Wave after wave slammed into the bow. Each impact sent vibrations throughout the ferry. Most passengers paid little attention. Ships make noises during storms. But shortly before 1 a.m., something happened that would later take on enormous significance. A loud metallic bang echoed from the bow area. The sound was heard by the seamen assigned to monitor the vehicle deck. It occurred as the vessel struck a particularly heavy wave. The noise was unusual enough that the seaman immediately informed the second officer. Concerned, the officer ordered him to investigate. The seaman moved toward the bow ramp area. He listened carefully. He checked the indicator lamps associated with the visor and ram blocking systems. Everything appeared normal. The indicators showed no warning signs, no alarms activated, no visible evidence suggested a problem. The seaman reported his findings. The bridge was reassured. For the moment, there appeared to be nothing wrong. But appearances can be deceptive. Unknown to everyone aboard, the sea had already begun tearing apart one of the ship's most critical structures. At the very front of the vessel sat a massive steel door known as the bow visor. Its purpose was simple: protect the vehicle loading ramp from the sea. But after hours of relentless punishment from wind and waves, that protection was beginning to fail, and within minutes the consequences would become catastrophic. Shortly after 1 a.m., passengers throughout the ship began hearing strange sounds: grinding, crashing, metal tearing against metal. Many would later describe them as sounding like explosions. What they were actually hearing was the beginning of the end. At exactly 1 a.m., the routine watch change took place on the bridge. The second officer and fourth officer assumed responsibility for navigation. The officers they relieved left the bridge. To those on duty, it appeared to be an ordinary transition. But below deck, the situation was rapidly changing. The sea continued battering the bow with tremendous force. Wave after wave crashed against the front of the ship. Each impact shook the vessel. Shortly after the watch change, reports of strange noises began spreading throughout the ferry. Passengers lying awake in their cabins heard heavy metallic crashes. Others described scraping sounds, grinding noises, impacts that seemed far louder than anything they had heard before. Some later compared the sounds to explosions. At first, many dismissed them. After all, the ship was sailing through rough weather. Unusual noises were not uncommon, but these sounds were different, and they were becoming more frequent, between approximately 1:05 and 1:15 a.m. Dozens of passengers and off-duty crew members heard the disturbing noises. Most came from the bow area. Each sound marked another stage in the destruction of the ship's most critical defense against the sea, the bow visor. At approximately 1:15 a.m., the battle between the ship and the sea reached its conclusion. The bow visor finally failed. After enduring hours of relentless punishment, the massive steel structure separated from the vessel. As it tore away, it tilted over the stem of the ship. In the process, it pulled the vehicle loading ramp fully open. Within seconds, the Baltic Sea gained direct access to the car deck. Water poured inside. Not a trickle, not a leak, a torrent. Wave after wave surged onto the open vehicle deck. For a roll-on, roll-off ferry like the Estonia, this was a catastrophic scenario. The vehicle deck was one vast open space. Once water entered, it could move freely from side to side. The ship's stability began disappearing almost immediately. Within moments, the vessel developed a severe starboard list. Passengers felt the deck tilt beneath them. Furniture began sliding. Objects crashed to the floor. People were thrown from their beds. The crew attempted corrective action. The ship was turned to port. Speed was reduced, but the flooding continued. The sea was now inside the ship, and there was no stopping it. The list increased rapidly. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, then more. Passengers awoke to chaos. Some struggled to understand what was happening. Others immediately sensed danger. Corridors became steep slopes. Walking became difficult, then nearly impossible. People stumbled and fell. Doors swung open, loose objects crashed through hallways. The ship's interior transformed into a maze of obstacles. Passengers rushed towards stairwells. Many hoped to reach the upper decks. Others searched desperately for family members. Parents called out for children. Friends became separated. Confusion spread. Fear followed, and then panic. In some areas of the ship, passengers became trapped. Cabin doors that had opened easily only minutes before now refused to move. The increasing angle of the vessel made escape impossible for many. Some would never leave their cabins, others fought their way upward through crowded passageways. Time was running out, and the ship continued to roll. At approximately 1:20 a.m., a voice suddenly echoed through the ship's public address system. Weak, uncertain, barely audible. A female voice. "Alarm! Alarm! There is alarm on the ship." The announcement lasted only moments, then silence. Shortly afterward, an internal crew alarm was transmitted. The situation had become impossible to ignore. Moments later, the general lifeboat alarm sounded throughout the vessel. For many passengers, it was the first official confirmation that something was terribly wrong. By now, the ship was listing heavily. Water had already begun entering accommodation spaces. The situation was deteriorating at a frightening pace. At 1:22 a.m., the first Mayday call was transmitted. The message was weak, broken, difficult to understand, but its meaning was unmistakable. The Estonia was in grave danger. A second distress call followed shortly afterward. Across the Baltic Sea, radio operators listened carefully. Ships in the region immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. By 1:24 a.m., 14 ships and shore-based radio stations had received the Mayday transmissions. Among them was the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Turku, Finland. The rescue operation was underway, but time was slipping away, fast. Around this time, all 4 main engines stopped. The ferry lost propulsion. Shortly afterward, the main generators also failed. Emergency generators automatically started, supplying power to critical systems and limited lighting throughout parts of the ship. But conditions inside the vessel were growing increasingly desperate. The Estonia was now drifting helplessly across the stormy sea. Broadside to the waves, the starboard list continued increasing. Floodwater spread rapidly through accommodation spaces. Passengers struggled to move. Some crawled along walls. Others climbed staircases that had become nearly vertical. Life jackets were distributed to those who managed to reach the upper decks. Many never got that far. Some passengers jumped into the sea. Others were swept overboard by the violent motion of the vessel. Inflatable life rafts deployed from the ship. A few survivors managed to climb aboard them. But the lifeboats remained unreachable. The list had become too extreme. The ship was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. At approximately 1:30 a.m., the starboard side of the Estonia became submerged. Flooding accelerated. Water poured deeper into the vessel. The list increased beyond recovery. 30 degrees, 60 degrees, then more. During the final stage of flooding, the ship rolled beyond 90 degrees. Inside, survivors fought desperately to escape. Many were forced to climb what had once been walls. Others clung to railings in complete darkness. The sea claimed deck after deck, compartment after compartment. Then, just 20 minutes later, it was over. At approximately 1:50 a.m., the Estonia sank rapidly, stern first. The vessel disappeared beneath the Baltic Sea. One moment she was there. The next, she was gone. On the radar screens of nearby ships, the signal vanished. Nearly 1,000 people had been aboard. Hundreds were now trapped beneath the waves. For those who escaped the sinking, the nightmare was only beginning. Alone in darkness, surrounded by towering waves, floating in water cold enough to kill within minutes, the Baltic Sea had claimed the ship. Now it was coming for the survivors. When the Estonia disappeared beneath the waves at approximately 1:50 a.m., the ordeal was far from over. For the survivors, it was only the beginning. The Baltic Sea was merciless. The water temperature hovered around 10 degrees Celsius. The air temperature was only slightly warmer. Strong winds whipped across the surface. Towering waves tossed life rafts and survivors through the darkness. Those who had escaped the ship now faced a different enemy: hypothermia. Many survivors drifted alone. Others clung desperately to inflatable life rafts. Some had life jackets, others had nothing at all. Around them echoed cries for help, voices carried across the stormy sea, men calling for loved ones, women pleading for assistance, people desperately trying to stay awake. As minutes passed, many voices faded. One by one, the cold claimed them. Survivors later described seeing dozens of people in the water. then fewer, then almost none. For many, the darkness seemed endless. Even before the Estonia vanished beneath the surface, rescue efforts had already begun. At 1:24 a.m., 14 ships and shore-based radio stations had received the vessel's distress calls. The Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Turku immediately launched a large-scale rescue operation. Passenger ferries sailing nearby altered course. Crews prepared rescue equipment. Medical teams stood ready. But reaching the scene would take time, and time was something the survivors did not have. Approximately 1 hour after the sinking, 4 passenger ferries arrived in the area. Their crews immediately began searching the darkness. Powerful searchlights swept across the waves. Lifeboats and rescue equipment were prepared. Yet conditions remained extremely difficult. The storm continued. The sea remained violent, and survivors were scattered across a vast area of water. The most important rescue assets would come from the sky. Helicopters were summoned from Finland and Sweden. Pilots prepared for one of the most challenging rescue operations in modern maritime history. At 3:05 a.m., the first rescue helicopter arrived at the disaster site. Below, searchlights illuminated a scene of devastation. Life rafts overturned by waves, survivors clinging desperately to safety, people drifting alone in the darkness. The pilots wasted no time. Rescue swimmers descended into the freezing sea. One survivor after another was hoisted to safety. Throughout the night and into the early morning hours, helicopters continued their relentless work. Crews pushed themselves to exhaustion, flying in darkness, battling strong winds, risking their own lives to save others. For many survivors, the sound of approaching rotor blades became the sound of hope. By sunrise, the scale of the tragedy was becoming clear. Of the 989 people who had boarded the Estonia in Tallinn only hours earlier, just 138 had been rescued alive. One of those survivors later died in hospital. The final number of survivors stood at 137. 852 people had lost their lives. Entire families disappeared. Friends vanished together. Crew members who had spent years working aboard the ship never returned home. During the day and over the following 2 days, recovery teams located and recovered 92 bodies. Hundreds more remained missing. Most had gone down with the vessel. The Baltic Sea had become their final resting place. Across Estonia, Sweden, Finland, and beyond, families waited desperately for news. Many would never receive the answers they sought. The search for the wreck began almost immediately. Investigators needed answers. Families needed closure, and governments needed to understand what had happened. The wreck was eventually located in international waters within Finland's search and rescue region. It rested approximately 80 meters below the surface of the Baltic Sea. There, on the seabed, lay the Estonia, silent, broken, a tomb for hundreds of victims. Investigators soon made another important discovery. The ship's bow visor was not attached to the wreck. Instead, it was found approximately 1 nautical mile west of the vessel. The discovery would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. In the weeks and months that followed, investigators from Estonia, Finland, and Sweden launched one of the largest maritime accident investigations in European history. Their task was simple: determine why a modern passenger ferry had sunk so quickly. Evidence soon pointed toward the bow visor. The investigation concluded that repeated impacts from heavy waves had caused the visor's locking mechanisms to fail. Once the visor detached, it pulled open the loading ramp behind it. This allowed massive quantities of seawater to flood the vehicle deck. For a roll-on roll-off ferry, such flooding was catastrophic. The vehicle deck's large open space allowed water to move freely from side to side. The ship's stability disappeared. Within minutes, recovery became impossible. The investigation concluded that the flooding of the vehicle deck was the primary cause of the sinking. The findings shocked the maritime industry. A vulnerability that many experts had underestimated had resulted in one of the deadliest ferry disasters in modern history. Yet not everyone accepted the official explanation. Questions began emerging almost immediately. Some survivors remained convinced they had heard explosions. Others questioned aspects of the investigation. Rumors spread, stories circulated, claims involving secret military cargo, government cover-ups, sabotage, submarines. Over time, these theories gained international attention. Documentaries explored alternative explanations. Books challenged official conclusions. For many grieving families, unanswered questions became difficult to ignore. Then, decades later, new discoveries reignited the debate. In 2020, filmmakers documented previously unseen damage on portions of the wreck's hull. Fresh investigations followed. Experts revisited evidence. New analyses were conducted. Yet after years of further study, investigators reaffirmed their original conclusion. There was no evidence that an explosion had sunk the vessel. No evidence of a collision with another ship or submarine. The primary cause remained the catastrophic failure of the bow visor and subsequent flooding of the vehicle deck. Still, debate continues to this day, and for some families it likely always will. The sinking of the Estonia changed maritime safety forever. Across Europe, ferry regulations were strengthened, bow door designs were improved, inspection procedures became more rigorous, emergency response systems were enhanced. The lessons learned from the disaster helped prevent future tragedies. But those lessons came at an unimaginable cost. Because behind every statistic was a person, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, a friend, a dream, a future. Today, memorials stand in Estonia and Sweden, places where families gather to remember those who never came home. The wreck itself remains on the seabed, protected as a maritime grave, a silent reminder of one of Europe's darkest peacetime disasters. On the evening of September 27, 1994, nearly 1,000 people boarded a ferry expecting an ordinary overnight journey. By sunrise, 852 of them were gone. The story of the MS Estonia is not merely a story about a ship. It is a story about human lives, about courage in the face of overwhelming odds, about the unforgiving power of nature, and about lessons written in tragedy. More than 30 years later, the Baltic Sea still guards the wreck of the Estonia. Beneath 80 meters of cold, dark water, the ship rests where she fell. Silent, undisturbed, but never forgotten, because on that stormy night in September 1994, the Baltic Sea did not simply claim a vessel, it claimed 852 souls.